Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time round, I want to be talking a little bit about asking the right questions. And this is actually something that is particularly challenging when you are starting out with development, or even if you've worked in other areas of development but then moving over to new sets of tools. It can be difficult to know what sort of, how to ask those questions properly and how to get help that you need when you're stuck on something. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So let's dive on in. So firstly, I just want to talk about what makes asking right questions difficult, because it is actually quite difficult, especially if you are new to the area. One of the big things is knowing what information is or isn't relevant takes time to learn. So it's very difficult to ask the right question when you might be looking at a whole sea of errors and not know which one is actually the cause of the problem, or which ones are relevant to include, or other bits of information about what you're using, how you're working with things that could be relevant. So without knowing that, it can make it very difficult to actually solve sort of the problem. So that's one of the big things early on, is figuring out what information to be asking. Now, the information you need, there's a big barrier here that it might not always be directly visible and accessible. So there's always going to be, if you're using something like of Unity, there's going to be, for example, your console log, and that console log can show various errors and information there. But you might get a problem that only occurs using a built version of your game, so you don't see the console log there. Now, it does log out information, but if you don't actually know that it does that, if you don't know where to find that, then it can make it very difficult to potentially diagnose things that are an issue there. Same as there are build options that allow you to actually see more information, and without knowing that those things exist, because a lot of tutorials, especially for the tutorials you're likely to be using when you are learning a new game engine, they're not going to cover things like that of, okay, where do you find the logs for a built game? What are the options you can use when building to make those logs and other information more accessible? So you need to be aware of those, but the tools don't end up telling you about them. So figuring out those things where they exist, and having seen this, you know that stuff like that now does exist for pretty much any game engine you encounter. Certainly all the ones I've used, anything that is happening and going wrong when it's running, that will typically appear in a log file. So they usually do have a log location. And I never remember reliably where the log location is. So I frequently am just going and checking the Unity docs, and you can just find it by looking as simple as, okay, Unity build log, or build output log. Or build log could actually show you information from when it's doing the build of your game. So again, you might end up finding, and this is part of the other sort of aspect with the problems, is the terminology gets tricky too. But looking for Unity and log files, that's going to generally get you within the range of one or two options that will be correct there. So it gets you closer to the problem. But yeah, knowing the information that's accessible, you might also be seeing things like the performance being really laggy at times. But if you don't know where to find the profiler in Unity, how to use it, how to interpret it, then you're not going to be able to get meaningful information there to be able to relay that to folks. So that's a big part of it, is figuring out what things are there. So that makes information difficult to access, which makes it hard to ask good questions. We're working with complex systems here because, say you're working on something in Unity, there's a lot of things at play there. You have Unity itself, which Unity itself is not just one single thing, because you can be using different packages with that. So you've got different render pipelines. There could be third-party add-ons that you're using with it. There could be different assets. But the problem might also not just be in Unity. It could be in whatever you're using for editing your code. So those tools are quite large in size as well. It could be something to do with the operating system you're running on. Less likely, but can happen. But so there's a lot of complex pieces there that are interacting. You've got operating system, your editing tool, the engine, whatever packages you're making usage of there, even down to things like your graphics card and drivers. There's a lot of different elements that could be a factor when you're getting odd behavior. So that can make it really difficult to discern the causes of ones. And while it is a very, very, very rare occurrence, I've seen cases where, okay, we were getting builds of the game that weren't working, but they were only failing when part of the code was being built on one person's machine. This was at a time when the builds were being distributed, the building of them across multiple machines. And it turns out that person, their RAM was slightly glitchy and needed to be replaced. And so when it was doing some of the background work for producing builds, it was actually inadvertently introducing errors. So really tricky to diagnose things like that at times. So we're working with very complex systems. So when you're a beginner in particular, trying to figure things out with this, it's understandably overwhelming and very difficult. Knowing where to ask the questions may not always be obvious. So we've got various search engines. We've also these days got the large language model backed ones. There's various tools or sites like Stack Overflow. You could be asking them on things like Reddit and stuff like that. There's a lot of different locations where you could be asking questions. And finding what's going to be the most useful can be tricky. So, and even if you're looking on those for answers, knowing what to actually look for is also tricky. But there's usually, for things like Unity, you do have sections there on Stack Overflow, on Reddit, devoted to Unity and other game engines where you could be asking specific questions. You do have a lot of stuff is going to show up at times in things like Google. Large language models are an option. The one caution I would say there with that is those aren't always going to give you the right answer. Same is true of the traditional search engines, and sometimes true of things on social media and that you're not going to necessarily get a reliable answer. So you do need to, that is again part of one of the things that you develop over time, is figuring out whether an answer is a good answer or not, and whether it's an applicable or helpful answer. That takes time. So just be mindful, and what my recommendation would be, finding out the information from multiple locations, essentially checking sources there for it to try and make sure you've got a reliable understanding of what's happening. Terminology is a huge, huge thing. There is a lot of terminology and a lot of jargon essentially when we're working with these tools, and knowing that right jargon actually makes a big difference. But there are barriers to that at times, because especially if you're going to be coming to this with a pre-existing set of jargon that and the more you might have worked in particular fields, the more jargon you might already have. And sometimes those same terms are used in multiple fields, but the actual meaning of them is very different in particular ones. So that's something that you can run into, is that the terms that you might be familiar with have a different meaning in this field and vice versa. So again, figuring out those terms does take time. And that's where I think one of the things that early on can be really useful to do is looking at questions that people are asking and answers that they're providing. Tutorials and things like that, I think, are also a good way of being able to encounter and experience and immerse yourself in the particular jargon, and even asking questions about it. If there's particular terms being used in a tutorial, ask what that term actually means. So that's something you can just be directly asking about too, to help build up that knowledge, to help you sort of have that larger framework of terms that you can use when you're asking questions. Now, even once you've got the information, knowing how to best provide it, how to organize it effectively, coherently, and convey that to someone can actually be, that takes practice. Asking good questions, providing good answers, both take practice, and you'll get better at it as you do more of it. But describing problems that you're encountering is a specific skill, and in particular, communicating a problem that you're encountering in a way that someone can effectively try to solve that is a specific skill. It's a directly employable skill. That's what QA is a large part of their job, is not just the discovery of problems. The discovery of problems is where they're part of where their job begins. And even before that, they're working out plans for trying to discover the problems and strategies for discovering the problems. But discovering the problems is kind of the part that most people will assume where it begins, but it does actually begin way before that. But once they've discovered them, they then are having to reproduce them and having to gather this information and having to describe them. And that, again, takes experience. Being able to concisely describe exactly what's happening and being able to provide all of the steps to reproduce a problem is something that is as I said, it's an employable skill. It's a very important and valuable skill. I know from in dev, working with QA folks, especially when they're folks that are really experienced with doing this, it makes my job so much easier, because that difference between getting a bug from someone who's very experienced versus someone who's fairly new. Often the ones that are very experienced, it's going to be a case of, okay, cool, even just from reading the bug, I can probably go and directly find exactly where the problem is and likely fix it. So this is a really important skill, and it's going to take time. So don't be hard on yourself if you are taking time to figure out how to ask good questions, because it is difficult. It takes time. So, okay, let's talk about providing helpful context, because this is key to asking a good question, is providing context that is going to help and facilitate the person that you're asking it to, or the people you're asking it to, being able to help you. So, big thing, give an overview of what were you trying to achieve and the problem that you are running into. So, for example, you're trying to make this particular thing X do Y, and when you do, Z happens. So it might be, I'm trying to make the player jump, but when I do, what happens is they fall through the floor. So describe it in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what's actually happening instead, which that works for a lot of the problems you'll likely encounter. The other problem is you might get ones where it's just, okay, well, I'm trying to do this, but I'm getting all of these errors. So it's not even getting to the stage of there is a Z that happens. It's a case of, yep, all of these things are going wrong. So provide that context is really important. Background on what tools you're using is really important. So knowing what Unity version or other engine version you're using is really helpful. because there are going to be some cases where certain things will work in one version, but they might not work in another. Knowing what IDE you're using. So if that's Visual Studio, if that's Rider, if that's VS Code, if it's Vim, or whatever tool you're using matters. And also where you're seeing the errors. If you're seeing the errors in Visual Studio, for example, but you don't see them in Unity, that actually means a very different thing versus you're seeing the errors in both. Because if you're only seeing them in one, and in this case, if you're only seeing them in Visual Studio, that actually is likely a configuration issue in Visual Studio and not a problem with what you're writing. So that's always an important thing to indicate. What tools you're using, where are you seeing the error? These days with Unity, because we have 3 different render pipelines, it is useful to indicate what render pipeline you are using. In particular, if you are encountering something that is a visual issue, where something is not looking the way that it is intended to, then very important to make sure you are including the pipeline. If it was a visual issue, I would also include things like, okay, well, what operating system are you running on? What graphics card do you have? What version of drivers do you have? Giving extra context there, I think, is particularly helpful. Lets people know and interpret the problems differently. Give a demonstration of the problem. Now, with giving a demonstration of the problem, that means things like, okay, console logs. So we've got console in Unity. You could be getting screenshots or video. Screenshots and video are most useful for if it is something where the problem is best conveyed visually. So if you're seeing some visual corruption, then a screenshot could be good for that. If it's something where it's a thing that's changing over time, and again, best conveyed visually. So that aspect of, okay, say you were trying to jump and you fell through the floor. A short video of that could actually be quite helpful, seeing what's happening over time. So providing those is really helpful. Make sure you're providing the relevant code as well. So that's something where your instinct might be, especially early on, just to provide, okay, the couple of lines of code where it might say there is a problem. My recommendation early on would be to be providing the entire file. The reason being is that the problems could actually be being caused by something further up, or the context that you need for that line is actually further up. So try to make sure you're providing the full files. What I would also say is most things that you might be pasting this into, whether that is, Stack Overflow, whether that is Reddit, whether that is, Discord or Slack, things like of that, all of those various tools have means to actually say what I am pasting in is code, and in a lot of cases to indicate the particular language that it's coming from. Make sure you make use of those tools, because those are going to change how it is formatted, and it will make the code be formatted more like the how the code would look in your editor that you're using. So that makes it much easier for people to read, to parse, and to help you. It is definitely possible to parse code where it is completely unformatted and there is no highlighting, anything like of that. But it is more difficult and it takes more effort to be parsing that. Whereas if you're able to use something that's at least formatting it somewhat, and even better if it's something that's able to do syntax highlighting, not everything will, but if it can, that makes that code much easier to parse. So make sure you're providing the full files, unless you are absolutely certain that you don't need to. And make sure you're using those markup tools to make it easier for people to be able to read your code. If it's a huge amount of code, then consider making some of it available. Could be via gists on Git, stuff like of that. So you've got different options there. Now, when you're describing the issue, keep the descriptions concise and clear. Make them easier to read. Dot points are obviously a great option for this. Just keep everything clear, clean, neat, and focus on here is the context, here is what's happening, here is what I'm wanting to have happening. And that's a big part of this approaching it like a QA tester, because that's really what you're in many ways doing here. So making sure you're giving a actionable description. So reproduce the problem and get a concise set of steps. So you might have been playing and running with stuff for ages, and your console log might be just absolutely filled to the brim. What I would do is save those logs initially first, but also make sure that you get a concise set of steps. So try to reproduce it again and try to get the smallest set of logs that shows the problem, but make sure it's a complete set of logs. So with that console output, try to be providing it as text, not as a screenshot. Big part of the reason there is a lot of platforms that you provide this stuff on, they will heavily compress images, and it can make them very difficult to read. The other thing is the console output, and I'm just going to jump to Unity to demonstrate this. So I'm going to create an error, and I'm in particular going to create one that will prevent it compiling. And if I go back to Unity, now I can see we've got an error. This is the other thing to watch for, is make sure that you don't have these turned off. The difference in highlighting is not always super visible. But we take a look at this error. This actually is giving us the specific position in code where it believes it's coming from. And I can usually double click on that and it'll go to wherever it is in my IDE. If I introduce something that will just break at runtime, which this will my own code design prevented me from being able to do something that would have been bad. So instead, I'm going to do that. That will give me an exception, and we'll see the difference in the information there. Because with the first one, with that compile error, the full info was largely here, but clicking on it did give me more info, and both of those are helpful to provide. But now I'll get it to cause an exception. And so with this, while all of these are the same, your temptation might be to just provide the last one, or the one that seems most relevant. I would be providing all of these. Now, the other thing we'll notice is when we click on these, it actually gives us the call stack that's referred to. So this essentially gives us a map to where the problem has occurred. And this is incredibly useful to be providing. So the full set of these errors here, grabbing that, but also for the very first error that you see, this is particularly useful. And if you see different ones coming through, then grabbing this detail here for each of those is going to make it much easier to resolve the problem. So something to just be aware of with that. Remove that so I don't end up accidentally leaving that in there, because that would be bad. So yes, provide things ideally as text, not a screenshot. When it's a screenshot, it's, as I said, compression, things like that can make it very difficult to solve. It's also, one of the things you can be doing with those errors that come up is searching for those, and that makes it easier to solve the problems. So if something is best described via an image or a video, then use that. So they're good to use for things where what you are seeing, it might be, okay, the shadows are looking corrupted, or the shadows are appearing in a weird location, or this particular thing that's being drawn has weird seams or other glitches to it. So things that are best described visually like that, or the things that happen over time. With those, grab a screenshot, or capture like a screen capture for the video. Don't use a picture from your phone. Even if it's something that's happening on your phone, a lot of devices these days have built-in support for you being able to grab a screenshot on the device or to capture a video on the device. So you can get something that is high quality and attach that. Using a phone screenshot actually makes things really difficult. One of the worst things is usually that little console log output. A phone screenshot from an angle of that is incredibly difficult to read, and often makes it just so much more difficult to try and solve the problem. So capture screenshots and video on device unless there is absolutely no other options. In cases there may be scenarios you run into where there isn't another option, but always try and capture stuff on the device where you can. Now, if need be, especially with still images, it might not always be obvious to the person that you're providing it to of what the particular problem is. So, boxes, arrows, things like of that you've added onto it be really helpful, especially if it's things like, well, this is here, but I'd expect it to be here. Indicate both on the image. It's going to make it a lot easier for people to be able to assist you. Now, attempting to find answers yourself. If you're encountering compile errors, which we saw, I was creating some ones before there by removing the semicolon. So with these, your game's not even going to start. Those, as we saw, can take you typically to a line close to the problem. So you might be able to do that and then see what the particular problem is. But even if it's not immediately obvious, those will also have an error. So if we go back to the code and I introduce an error, then you'll see here, I'll usually have a formatting like this. So error, and then usually if it's coming from particular Microsoft compilers, it'll have some letters and some numbers. That CS1002 is something you can directly search for then in whatever tool you prefer to use. So you can use things like that to try and track down the particular problems. So that code is searchable, so that can be a great way to find the answers. Same thing with the exceptions. They always have a little bit of information there in terms of, okay, it might be a null reference exception or an argument out of range exception or invalid operation. Those are things you can directly search for. So look for those things, and those will help you. May not directly solve your problem, because sometimes these errors, there could be multiple causes, but it will at least help get you closer. It can at least give you some context and some things to try, which that also is really helpful, because you might not manage to solve the problem, but have tried a bunch of things. So then when you're asking people about it, you can convey that as well. That makes it really easy for folks to help you, because then they immediately know, okay, cool, we can eliminate all of these different things as possible problems. So, okay, that leaves us with other solutions that we can look for. So it's really helpful. You also want to understand the different types of errors that you might encounter. So compiler errors, like the one I created before, those are going to prevent your code from running. Those are usually the easiest to track down, because you can't get any further without actually resolving those. So those can be really useful. Exceptions, which was the other type of problem that I created. Those, one of the big things to understand with those is how they behave, and in terms of once an exception occurs, the rest of the code in that function does not run. So if you are getting an exception, then what can happen is it can leave your code in a bad state, and then your game can keep running, but it's going to keep running into other errors, and it can run into errors that absolutely make no sense because it's gotten into such a bad state. This is why the approach that I always adopt, that you'll find, studios will generally adopt as a best practice, is as soon as there are exceptions, I stop and I fix them. Compiler errors, you kind of have no choice but to fix them, but exceptions, you fix them immediately. First time you encounter it, you track it down, you fix it then and there. You don't leave it. Warnings aren't going to prevent things from running, but you fix them. Log errors aren't going to prevent things from running, but as soon as you encounter them, you fix them. So that's one of the things that really strongly recommend is the second there are any errors, that there are any warnings, that there are any exceptions, you stop, you fix them. Once they are fixed, then you move on. That is going to mean that you have a far more reliable, stable code base to be working from, and it's going to mean you run into a lot less issues. So that's a practice that I very, very, very strongly recommend you adopt. Do not ignore warnings, do not ignore errors, do not ignore exceptions. Just because the tools might let you doesn't mean you should, and actually, trust me, it means you shouldn't. Logic errors are the other type of ones that you'll run into though. And these are the tricky ones often, because a logic error, you won't often have any warnings or any errors. Things just don't behave the way that you expect them to. There's no helpful, red marker showing, okay, this area of the code is bad. You'll just do something in the game and something unexpected will happen. So those ones are much trickier to track down. Those are ones where having more of those things like screenshots and video can be really helpful. And in particular, we're doing some testing to try and get, okay, the most concise set of steps to cause the problem will actually help. Logic ones, you possibly end up needing to provide a lot more context to, because if it's a logic error, there could be a much larger set of code that it's actually causing the problem. So something to be aware of with that. So whenever you're encountering these things, if there are error messages, if there are warnings, if there are exceptions, you can search for those. Most tools are going to be able to give you useful information on them, and then that can help at least try and get closer to tracking down the problem. And always, please, always start with the first one. One of the worst things that you can do is getting there and trying to fix the last error or exception or warning first. The reason being is that it is very easy for early ones to cause things to be in an unintended state. That applies to compiler errors. Various ones that you can create there could cause other sections of code to break. It's less common in C#, but as someone who's come from C++, where you might be working on stuff and it's like, I have 1,600 errors, and you make one tiny change, and it's like, I have 20 errors, and then you make another fix, and it's like, I have 500 errors. That can happen, but the key to resolving that is you start with the first one and you work your way down. Always, always start with the first one. So if there is nothing else that you take from this, if the two things that you take from this and nothing else would be never ignore warnings and errors and exceptions, and when you're fixing them, always start with the first one. If that's all that people take from it, even only one of those two things, that's going to be great. So, okay, big final thing that I want to add in here is don't forget that there's a human on the other side of the screen. And these things apply for both the person asking and the person answering. Be kind and be patient. When people are asking for help with stuff, it's pretty common that they might be doing it because they're really stressed. As someone who's been a teacher for a fair while, you'll get people that will be, through to various circumstances, not always, because they've been lazy, often just because of bad luck and bad timing and lots of things happening. They're not getting to stuff as early as they, ideally should have, but that's what happens. Life happens and things don't always get sorted as early as we'd like them to. So that means they might be asking at the last minute and they're going to be pretty stressed. And so the person answering needs to be kind and patient there, but the person asking also needs to be kind and patient. If you're there and asking questions, keep in mind that the person you're asking them to might have stuff that they're needing to do. They're not going to be able to answer you immediately, especially if this is something in like a teaching situation. They might be getting bombarded with questions from everyone, and it takes time to get through all of those, and some things might be quick to reply to, some things might take a long time to reply to. So being patient and accepting that, okay, the person will ask the question and it might take a bit for them to get back to you. So be patient there on both sides. Be kind and be patient. The other things to keep in mind there, like I said, providing context. That is not just one for, the person asking the question needs to provide context. The person answering it needs to provide context. And this is, again, it's coming from a teaching background. I think an unhelpful way to answer a question is, oh, yeah, that's bad, do this. And just that. Because the person doesn't really learn anything from that. They don't know why one of the things is bad and the other is good. And that's not great. That's a bad experience for that person because they don't learn as much as they could. It's far better to explain, okay, yeah, this thing is going to run into these particular problems and that's why you're seeing this. This thing is a better option, and it's a better option because of this. I think it's always really important when you are answering questions, and in particular questions where you're trying to solve problems, always give context. I think it just really helps. It helps that person learn because you're not just giving them the answer, you're explaining the answer and the situation, and that is going to mean they learn a lot more from it, and that's good. We want them to be able to learn more because that allows people to then be able to, get better at this, to find solutions themselves, and potentially in time then, if they're wanting to, also help other people, which is great. Communicate the results. This is a big thing as well. So if someone suggests, okay, here's some stuff that you can try, let them know whether that worked or not. Don't just, if it works, don't just go silent. One of the worst things I think for people is getting to, running into a similar problem. They search for it and then they find an answer somewhere where someone's like, hey, here's a solution for it. And the original person has never responded saying whether that worked or not. And you don't know whether the solutions have actually solved the problem. Or the other thing that you'll often see is person will ask a question. There'll be some suggestions and some replies. And then there might be a reply from the original asker going, oh, I solved it, and nothing else. Give context, give information. Make more of a help there to assist other people, because the problems that we run into with game development, we're not going to be the first ones to run into them. We're not going to be the only ones to run into them. Other people are going to run into them at times. And so if we can make those resources more useful, that's always a win. Sometimes it might also be the case that you run into a problem that you have previously run into and asked about. I've had that before where I've gone and run into something and looked for it, and then what I end up finding is my own post asking about it. And so in cases like of that, you want to make sure that there's good and useful and helpful things included in there. It's really important. So yes, please just make sure you are communicating what actually solved the problem. It's always going to be really, really helpful. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video helpful. Like I said, with the questions, it's going to take time to get better at asking good questions, but practice helps with that, and going through and getting that good context, providing clear information, and remembering that you're interacting with a human. These things are really going to sort of help with being able to let you ask better questions, and also help with then people giving you answers that are going to solve the problem much sooner. I do hope you found the video helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It really helps out, really appreciate it. If you have any questions, chuck those in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's a link to that in the description also. But until next time, bye.